Have you ever started a journey and realized that the most important thing you carried was not money, not maps, not even weapons, but food? In the centuries before railroads and carriages made travel faster, a simple loaf of bread or a pouch of dried grain could mean the difference between reaching your destination or collapsing along the way. Travelers carried food as if it were treasure, and with good reason. It was not only precious, it was fragile. Every step of the road tested it, and every mile brought the danger that it might be stolen, spoiled, or lost. Hello everyone, and welcome. Tonight we begin uncovering the forgotten tricks that travelers once used to keep their food safe. These were not grand inventions or marvels of science. They were small, clever habits, born of necessity, practiced by countless men and women who walked lonely roads, crossed muddy fields, and rested in crowded inns. And if you enjoy walking through these quiet corners of history with me, you may gently subscribe, so each new story finds its way to you like a steady lantern guiding the path. Food shaped every journey. A traveler could risk walking without proper boots, or even make do without a map, but not without something to eat. Villages were far apart, markets often closed by nightfall, and strangers could not always be trusted to share. To guard one's food was to guard one's survival, yet food was never easy to protect. It spoiled in the rain, crumbled in bags, invited insects, and above all, it tempted thieves. Imagine setting out with a bundle of bread, cheese, and dried grain. By day, the sun beat down, and you worried about heat softening your rations. By night, you worried about rats sniffing through the seams of your bag. At inns, strangers sat close, eyes drifting toward your pack. On the road, desperate beggars eyed your pouch. Even among fellow travelers, hunger tested friendship. To eat in peace was a luxury few enjoyed. To keep food safe was a constant task. The fear of losing food shaped how people walked. They slung their packs across their shoulders, hands always near, checking knots and ties. They avoided leaving bundles unattended, even for a moment. Some slept with their bags as pillows. Others tied straps around their arms, so that if anyone tugged at night, the pull would wake them. Food was not merely carried, it was guarded. The tricks began with containers, leather pouches, cloth bags, wooden boxes. Each had its uses, each its risks. Leather kept out damp, but grew stiff with age. Cloth was light, but easy to tear. Wooden boxes were sturdy, but heavy. Travelers learned to combine them. A small box wrapped in cloth, tucked into a leather pouch, then tied with rope. Each layer added effort for thieves. Each slowed insects and moisture. It was a puzzle of protection, and those who traveled often became masters of such small defenses. But protection was not only about keeping food inside. It was about making it appear worthless to others. Have you ever hidden something valuable inside something ordinary? Travelers did the same. They wrapped food in rags that looked like dirty laundry. They tied grain sacks with extra knots, so they appeared like bundles of tools. They even smeared ashes on the outside of packages, so that thieves, mistaking them for trash, would pass them by. Despite these efforts, the fear never left. Every time a bag shifted, every time a pouch felt lighter, suspicion stirred. Was something missing? Had someone reached inside while they slept? The mind itself became a thief, whispering doubts. And so, even when food remained safe, the burden of worry traveled alongside it. So why call this chapter The Fear of Losing Food on the Road? Because before the tricks, before the clever disguises and secret knots, there was fear. Fear sharpened the mind, fear drove invention, fear made every traveler cautious. Without it, the tricks would never have been born. Food was not only nourishment. It was safety, it was survival, it was the most fragile treasure a traveler carried. And to lose, it was to lose hope of reaching the journey's end. Have you ever tried to hide something, not by burying it deep, but by leaving it where everyone could see it, disguised so cleverly that no one noticed? Travelers centuries ago knew that food was both treasure and target, and one of their simplest tricks was to hide it not in secret corners, but in plain sight. The art of disguise was often more effective than locks or knots, because thieves looked for valuables, not for what appeared worthless. The most common disguise was to make food look like clothing or laundry. Travelers wrapped loaves of bread in worn rags, tying them into rolls that resembled spare shirts. Dried meat or cheese could be bundled with patched socks or folded linen, giving the impression of nothing worth stealing. Have you ever glanced at a bundle of old clothes and thought nothing of it? That was the reaction thieves often had. By hiding food in the guise of the ordinary, travelers passed unnoticed. Another trick was to mix food among tools. Grain or beans could be poured into small pouches and then tucked inside saddlebags filled with hammers, nails, or ropes. A thief searching quickly might lift the bag, feel the weight of iron, and move on, never suspecting that the food was buried within. Travelers who worked as craftsmen had an advantage here, for their tools provided natural camouflage. Disguises could be even stranger. Some carried small sacks of flour or meal disguised as bags of sand. From the outside, both looked alike, and in haste, a thief might dismiss them. Others stored food in containers that seemed too humble to matter. A wooden box stained and scarred, a basket patched with wire, a cracked jar sealed with clay. To the casual eye, these looked like rubbish. Yet inside lay carefully wrapped provisions, safe behind a disguise of poverty. Hiding food in plain sight was not only about thieves, it was also about hunger among companions. When food was scarce, even friends could grow suspicious, glancing toward another's pack. By making food look unappetizing or ordinary, a traveler could avoid difficult conversations and quiet temptations. One story told of a group who wrapped cheese in a cloth marked with black soot, so it looked like nothing more than burnt rags. They ate it later in secret, while others searched for scraps in vain. The cleverest disguises were layered. Food hidden inside pouches of grain, then placed inside a basket of tools, then covered by rough cloth. Each layer discouraged curiosity. To reach the heart, one had to ignore boredom, weight, and filth. Thieves rarely bothered. They wanted purses, coins, quick prizes. Few lingered to sift through laundry or to untie bundles that smelled of rope and dust. Yet there were risks. Sometimes disguises worked too well. A traveler might forget which bundle contained bread and which held spare shirts, discovering too late that food had been left to spoil. Others misplaced sacks, abandoning what they thought was worthless only to realize later it had held their last provisions. Hiding food in plain sight was effective, but it demanded memory and care. Still, It was one of the simplest tricks, practiced by nearly everyone who traveled long roads. It required no special tools, no heavy locks, only a clever eye and a willingness to make the valuable appear unworthy. In a world where the hungry searched for riches, survival often belonged to those who disguised their treasure as trash. So why call this chapter Hiding Food in Plain Sight? Because the trick was not about strength or secrecy, but about deception. Travelers survived by making their most important possessions look like nothing at all. The art of disguise turned bread into rags, grain into ballast, cheese into soot-covered bundles. And through these simple acts, countless journeys continued safely, unnoticed by those who might otherwise have taken everything. Have you ever tied a knot so carefully that you felt certain no one could undo it without leaving a trace? Or sealed a container so tightly that you knew you would be the first to break it open? For travelers long ago, sealing food was one of the most important tricks they could master. Food needed not only to be carried, but also to be protected from damp air, from hungry pests, from careless spilling, and from the hands of thieves. The simplest seals were knots. A length of rope twisted in ways both clever and strange could discourage even the boldest thief. Have you ever tried to untie a knot you did not make? The fingers hesitate, pulling one thread, then another, until the whole becomes a puzzle. Travelers tied knots not only to secure but also to signal. A companion opening a bag could do so easily if they knew the pattern, but a stranger would fumble and leave evidence of tampering. The knot became a silent witness, telling its owner whether the bag had been touched. Cloth bags were the most common carriers of grain, beans, or dried fruit. To protect them, travelers folded the edges, stitched them shut with thread, or tied them with rope dipped in wax. Wax hardened into a seal that cracked loudly when broken, impossible to open in secret. Some carved small marks into the wax, a personal sign known only to them. In this way, a bag became more than storage. It became a container guarded by memory, marked with signs that only its owner understood. Jars and pots offered different challenges. Clay kept food dry, but lids slipped easily unless secured. Travelers used melted fat or resin to glue lids in place or wrap them tightly with strips of cloth soaked in water, which shrank as it dried and bound the cover firm. Some even tied lids with rope and pressed soft clay over the knots, creating a barrier that crumbled if disturbed. Such tricks required patience, but they gave reassurance on lonely roads where trust was scarce. Sealing was not only about strength, it was about time. A clever knot or hardened wax slowed a thief, forcing them to pause. On a busy road or in a crowded inn, those few seconds could mean discovery. Many thieves wanted speed, not puzzles. If a bag resisted, they moved on. Thus the seal did not need to be unbreakable, only troublesome. There were tricks of smell as well. To keep pests away, travelers sealed food with herbs. Cloth dipped in strong scented plants was tied around the mouths of jars, masking the aroma of grain or cheese. To a rat or dog, the scent of mint or bitter leaves was confusing, leading them away from the true contents. Some mixed ash into outer wrappings, discouraging insects with its dryness. These were not charms or spells, but simple observations, repeated until they became habit. But sealing had risks, too. Too tight and food spoiled for lack of air. too loose, and it invited decay. A traveler might open a jar after many days only to find bread soft with mold or grain damp with sweat. Every seal was a balance, a guess between protection and suffocation. And yet, even when mistakes were made, travelers preferred to risk spoilage than theft. Better to lose food slowly than all at once. Imagine the quiet of a roadside camp. A traveler finishes their meal, carefully ties the bag with practiced hands, presses a little wax into the knot, and sets it by their side. They do not sleep easily, but they sleep more soundly than if the bag lay open. The seal, however small, brings peace. It tells them, "This is yours, and if it is taken, you will know." So why call this chapter Sealing Jars and Bags? Because safety often came not from swords or guards, but from the humble art of tying, pressing, and marking. A sealed bag was not unbreakable, but it was guarded by craft and care. And through such small acts, travelers carried not only food, but also the comfort of knowing they had done all they could to protect it. Have you ever left a bit of food on a table or in a bag, only to return and find it nibbled by something you never even saw? For travelers in the past, animals were constant thieves. A loaf of bread or a pouch of grain tempted not only people, but also rats, mice, dogs, birds, and insects. Food seemed to call to them in the night, and once they arrived, they rarely left without taking something. Keeping animals away was one of the greatest challenges of traveling, and it gave rise to many strange and clever tricks. At night, rodents were the worst enemy. Rats could chew through cloth, gnaw leather straps, and slip into bags with alarming ease. Travelers learned quickly that food must be hung, not left on the ground. In camps, they strung ropes between trees and suspended bags from the middle, out of reach of scurrying claws. Have you ever seen a bird feeder swaying, safe from squirrels? The same idea kept food safe centuries ago, long before it was written down as advice. Dogs and stray animals presented a different problem. Their noses were sharp, their appetites endless. Travelers sometimes rubbed the outsides of their sacks with ash or bitter herbs, disguising the scent. A bag smelling of soot or smoke was less inviting than one smelling of cheese. Others smeared outer wrappings with clay or mud, creating not only a seal against damp, but also a surface that tasted unpleasant to curious tongues. To a dog, the difference was enough to turn attention elsewhere. Insects posed subtler dangers. Ants marched in long lines, slipping into every crack. Beetles burrowed into sacks, leaving food riddled with holes. To fight them, travelers used circles of water. They placed legs of small tables or stands in shallow bowls, creating moats that insects could not cross. For those without tables, they smeared sticky resin around bags or sprinkled fine ash in circles, barriers that ants hesitated to cross. Simple, practical, and effective. Birds were bold in daylight. Ravens, crows, and even smaller sparrows learned quickly that travelers carried food. To protect against them, people covered bundles with extra cloth, disguising shapes. Some tied rattling shells or stones that clinked when moved, scaring birds away. Have you ever seen scarecrows in fields? Travelers carried their miniature versions, shifting objects that startled curious beaks. Even larger animals caused worry. In forested areas, foxes crept close, sniffing for scraps. In open plains, wandering horses or cattle might nose into bags drawn by the salt of dried meat or grain. For these, travelers relied on firelight, not for mystic power, but for practical deterrence. Animals disliked flames. A lantern or small fire, placed near bundles, created a circle of safety. Few creatures approached what flickered and hissed. But tricks were not always foolproof. Stories told of entire camps raided by rats despite every hanging bag, or of clever birds tearing open knots with their beaks. Still, travelers persisted, refining their methods, passing them down as quiet wisdom. The fight against animals was never won completely, but each trick gave a little more safety, a little more peace. The most ingenious travelers combined methods. Food hung from ropes, wrapped in cloth, rubbed with ash, tied with rattling shells, and placed near fire. Each layer of defense added a measure of protection. A rat might climb but be discouraged by scent. A dog might sniff but be turned away by bitterness. A bird might approach but startle at sound. Survival was often a matter of stacking tricks until they worked well enough. So why call this chapter Keeping Animals Away? Because no matter how careful a traveler was with thieves, ropes, or seals, animals were always there, waiting, silent or bold, claws scratching or wings flapping. To journey with food was to journey with constant risk from nature itself, and those who learned how to keep the creatures at bay carried their meals further, fed their companions longer, and endured their journeys with a little less fear. Have you ever noticed how sometimes the best way to protect something is not to lock it away, but to make others believe they already have a part in it? Travelers of the past often discovered that food was safer when it seemed less secret. To survive the road, they learned an odd trick. Sometimes they shared their food openly, and sometimes they only pretended to. Both were ways of keeping what mattered most from being taken. Food was a sensitive subject among groups. Hunger changed people. A companion who had walked miles without a meal could look with suspicion at another's bundle. Eyes drifted, conversations grew tense, trust thinned. In such moments, sharing became a defense. By offering a little, a traveler quieted suspicion. A crust of bread, a handful of beans, a slice of cheese. Enough to calm questions, but not enough to empty supplies. In return, the rest of the bundle stayed untouched. But not all sharing was real. Many practiced the art of pretending. A traveler might hand over stale scraps while keeping the fresher food hidden, or they might produce a bag with a small portion at the top, making it seem that was all they carried. Others carried decoy food, poorer quality, meant to be offered when asked. It was a subtle game, balancing generosity with self-preservation. Too much refusal caused resentment. Too much sharing left one hungry. The trick was to give just enough. There were clever performances, too. A traveler might take out a bundle and sigh, saying it was their last. They tore off a piece and passed it around, though in truth more lay hidden deeper in their pack. Another might complain of poor quality, convincing others the food was hardly worth taking. To disguise wealth with grumbling was as much a trick as any knot or seal. This strategy was not without risk. Some companions saw through the act. A false gift could sour trust, and in desperate times suspicion turned dangerous. Yet most of the time, hunger was eased by even small portions, and the illusion of fairness mattered more than the food itself. Have you ever noticed how a gesture, even a small one, can soften tension? That was the power of sharing, real or not. Among strangers, the game grew more delicate. At inns or on crowded roads, travelers knew better than to flaunt full meals. To bring out too much was to invite unwanted attention. Instead, they ate slowly, modestly, giving the impression that their supplies were as thin as anyone else's. Some even carried empty cloths, unwrapped them as though meals were gone, and chewed on small pieces in silence, fooling others into thinking there was nothing left to take. Sharing also carried hidden strength. Those who gave a little often received protection in return. A crumb offered to a stranger could turn them into a watchful ally, someone who later warned of thieves or helped in camp. Food was not only nourishment, it was currency, and a few bites could buy safety on the road. Travelers who understood this found that generosity, real or staged, kept their greater treasures safe. So why call this chapter Sharing or Pretending to Share? Because travelers lived in a world where food was both fragile and precious, and the line between trust and suspicion was thin. To survive, they mastered not only the art of guarding, but also the art of appearing fair. Some gave truly, others gave falsely, but both understood the same lesson, that sometimes the best way to keep food safe was to make others believe they had already been given enough. And if you've enjoyed discovering how survival depended not only on knots and jars, but on clever human behavior, you may gently subscribe, so each new journey into forgotten history comes to you with steady regularity. Just as travelers shared small portions to continue their journey, I share these stories so that our path through the past never goes dark. Have you ever carried something valuable and created a fake version of it, just so that if someone tried to take it, they would seize the false and leave the true? Travelers centuries ago knew this trick well. They often used decoy food, provisions meant not for eating, but for losing. It was a clever defense against thieves, beggars, and even suspicious companions. The idea was simple: carry two kinds of food. One was hidden carefully, wrapped, sealed, and disguised. The other was carried more openly, appearing to be all that a traveler had. When trouble came, a roadside thief demanding supplies, a beggar pressing too insistently, or even a nosy companion, the decoy food was offered. It satisfied demands while leaving the real provisions untouched. Decoys came in many forms. Some were actual food, but of poor quality. Hard crusts, stale bread, dried beans too tough to chew. Others prepared scraps deliberately, pieces of spoiled grain or cheese beginning to crack. To the desperate, these still had value. To the traveler, they were expendable. By sacrificing what they could spare, they preserved what mattered most. Sometimes decoy food was made to look richer than it was. A bag tied loosely at the top, filled halfway with chaff or husks, gave the impression of abundance. A thief in a hurry grabbed it and fled, never realizing the true food was wrapped more securely inside another bag. The trick relied on haste. Few robbers examined what they took before running. In inns or markets, decoys served different purposes. A traveler might place a small pouch of coarse grain where it could be seen, while keeping finer provisions out of sight. Curious eyes, seeing the rough food, assumed that was all there was. In this way, the decoy drew attention away from the hidden store. But carrying decoys was not without cost. It meant extra weight, extra space, and the constant risk of confusing one's own supplies. Stories told of travelers who, in moments of hunger, reached for the wrong bag and discovered too late that they had carried only husks. To avoid this, careful marks were used. A knot tied in a certain way, a strip of cloth of a different color, signals to remind the owner which bag was real and which was false. There was also danger in giving away too much. A thief, satisfied with scraps, might return later, realizing the traveler had survived too well. A companion offered poor food might feel insulted and suspicious. Decoys worked best in moments of speed, when there was no time for reflection. The trick was not to deceive forever, only to deceive long enough. The cleverest travelers went further. They carried multiple layers, one decoy for the road, another for the camp, and still another for the inn. Each suited its place. On the road, the decoy might be a bag of husks. In camp, it might be a visible pouch of stale bread. At inns, it might be a meal eaten publicly while better food remained hidden. The variety ensured that no single defense failed everywhere. So why call this chapter Decoy Food? Because travelers understood that safety often meant sacrifice. Better to lose something small than everything. Better to surrender a bag of scraps than to fight over bread. The decoy was not only a trick of the hand, but a trick of the mind, teaching thieves, beggars, and rivals to believe they had already taken enough. Have you ever noticed how strong the smell can be, and how it can guide you even when your eyes are closed? Travelers of the past knew this truth well, but they also knew that smell was a danger. Food carried scent, and scent carried risk. A loaf of bread could be detected long before it was seen. A pouch of dried meat or a lump of cheese sent out a trail of aroma that reached both animals and people. To keep food safe, travelers had to learn not only to carry it, but also to control its smell. The most basic trick was masking. Travelers wrapped food in layers of cloth, sometimes smeared with ash or clay. The earthiness disguised the aroma, making a bundle smell more like dirt or smoke than food. Have you ever walked past a campfire and found the scent overwhelming? Imagine a thief sniffing at a bag only to catch the same harsh smoke. They moved on, assuming nothing good lay inside. Another trick was to overwhelm the nose with stronger odors. Herbs such as mint, sage, or garlic were often tucked among supplies, not for flavoring, but for disguise. Their sharp scents spread quickly, hiding the milder notes of bread or grain. Some even carried small pouches of resin or tar, sticky substances with powerful smells that clung to bags. To an outsider, the scent of food was lost beneath harsher notes. There were cleverer methods still. Travelers placed food near their animals, letting the natural smell of horses, donkeys, or dogs overpower the aroma of grain. Saddlebags, rubbed with sweat and leather, carried food unnoticed because the animal's scent dominated. In camps, food was placed close to fire, where smoke disguised everything. It was not pleasant, but it was safer. Not all tricks were about masking. Some were about misleading. A bag filled with empty shells of nuts or the husks of beans was left in plain sight. It smelled faintly of food, enough to attract a thief, but inside was nothing of value. While they wasted time with husks, the real food remained hidden, wrapped in stronger scents elsewhere. The art of deception worked even on the nose, but the problem of smell was not limited to people. Animals had sharper senses. Rats sniffed out crumbs and sealed jars. Dogs caught the faintest whiff of dried meat. Birds spotted what their beaks desired from the air. To fight this, travelers used ashes spread around camps, creating circles that dulled scent trails. Some rubbed fat or oil on outer bags, confusing animals with a uniform smell. Others hung food high in trees, where scents spread too widely to lead creatures to one point. Still, mistakes happened. A crack in a jar, a careless spill, and the aroma spread like a signal. Many stories told of travelers waking to find their bags chewed open, the night filled with the rustle of tiny feet. Some learned the hard way that scent was a stronger enemy than sight. A hidden bundle was useless if its smell betrayed it. So why call this chapter Using Smell Against Thieves? Because travelers understood that scent could be turned from weakness into strength. By masking, overwhelming, or misleading, they bent the nose to their will. The road was full of dangers, and many eyes watched, but noses watched more keenly still. Those who learned to master smell carried their food further, slept more peacefully, and found that survival sometimes depended not on what others saw, but on what they failed to smell. Have you ever noticed how much difference the right container makes? A fragile item wrapped in cloth might shatter, but in a sturdy box it lasts the journey. For travelers of centuries past, food was no different. The type of container chosen often decided whether provisions reached the end of the road or spoiled along the way. Containers were more than storage. They were protection, disguise, and sometimes even a test of skill to open. Cloth bags were the simplest and most common. They were light, easy to carry, and could be tied to belts or slung over shoulders. Bread and grain often traveled this way, yet cloth was vulnerable. It tore, it absorbed moisture, and it offered little defense against teeth or claws. To strengthen it, travelers doubled or even tripled the layers, sometimes coating the outer fabric with wax or resin. This gave the cloth stiffness and made it harder for dampness to creep inside. Leather pouches were sturdier. Oiled leather resisted water, keeping food dry even in storms. A traveler with a leather pouch could cross a river without fear of losing grain to the current. Yet leather had its drawbacks. It was heavy, stiff, and when pierced, it often split further. Many carried small leather cases only for their most precious food, like dried fruit or hard cheese, while leaving bulkier rations and lighter sacks. Wooden boxes were heavier still, but offered unmatched strength. A well-made wooden box kept food safe from crushing weight, sharp claws, and clumsy accidents. Some boxes had sliding lids, others hinged covers, and a few even featured clever catches or pins that served as primitive locks. Imagine a thief snatching a box and wasting time trying to pry it open, while the owner slipped away. The weight was burdensome, but the peace of mind was worth it. Clay jars were another favorite. Though fragile if dropped, they sealed tightly against air and insects. Lids covered in wax or wrapped with cloth kept contents fresh. Jars were especially valued for liquids like oil or honey, but dry goods could be stored in them as well. The trick was in transport. Jars had to be cushioned in baskets or wrapped in straw. A broken jar meant disaster, so only careful travelers dared to carry them far. Baskets themselves were also used, not only as carriers but as disguises. From the outside, a basket looked like a container for tools, kindling, or laundry. Inside, with a layer of cloth, it became a safe place for food. Thieves often overlooked baskets, assuming them too ordinary. Some baskets were even double-woven, with false bottoms or hidden compartments. Food could be tucked away unseen, safe beneath a layer of harmless goods. Metal containers were rare, but when used, they offered strong protection. Small tins or iron pots doubled as cooking vessels. Food stored inside was secure, for metal resisted gnawing teeth and crushing blows. Yet the clatter of metal could betray a traveler, and the weight slowed every step. Thus, metal was chosen sparingly for the times when strength mattered more than speed. Each container carried trade-offs: cloth for lightness, leather for water resistance, wood for strength, clay for preservation, baskets for disguise, and metal for durability. The wisest travelers combined them. A small wooden box might be tucked inside a cloth bag, then placed in a basket. A jar might be cushioned in straw inside a leather pouch. Every layer added safety, and every container played its part. So why call this chapter The Role of Containers? Because containers were not merely vessels. They were guardians, shields against weather, pests, thieves, and time itself. A clever traveler knew that the right choice of container could make the difference between hunger and survival. In the end, food was only as safe as the box, bag, or jar that held it. Have you ever stayed in a place where the walls were thin, the doors didn't lock, and strangers moved just a few steps away from where you slept? That was the reality of inns in centuries past. To travelers, an inn offered shelter from the road, but it did not guarantee safety. And when it came to food, inns were some of the most dangerous places of all. Food was vulnerable in inns for one simple reason: too many eyes. Everyone staying there was on a journey. Everyone was tired, and everyone was hungry. Meals were often sold at the inn, but travelers still brought their own provisions. And those provisions tempted not only other guests, but sometimes the innkeepers themselves. To guard food in such a setting required vigilance, patience, and no small amount of creativity. One of the oldest tricks was never leaving food unattended. Travelers learned to keep their bags close, tied to their belts while sitting, tucked beneath their arms while resting, or even used as pillows at night. Have you ever fallen asleep hugging something precious, knowing that if it moved, you would wake? That was how travelers slept in inns. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safer than leaving food at a distance. Some travelers took shifts. If they were in groups, one stayed awake while the others slept, keeping an eye on the bundles. In crowded inns where strangers jostled together in common rooms, a watchful companion was worth more than a locked chest. Even then, caution was needed. Not all thieves moved by night. Some stole in daylight, slipping food away, while others were distracted by meals or conversation. To disguise food in inns, travelers used the same tricks as on the road: hiding it in dirty laundry, storing it in baskets that looked like tool carriers, or keeping it in jars sealed with wax. But they added a new layer: performance. Many deliberately acted as though they had less than they truly did. A loaf of bread was sliced thinly, portions stretched, the impression given that it was nearly gone. The real store remained hidden deeper in their packs. Some even staged false meals. They brought out scraps, eating them with show, so others thought their supplies were finished. In truth, better food remained untouched. Have you ever seen someone pretend to eat more than they actually had? It was a theater of survival, played nightly in crowded inns. The walls of inns also taught caution. Whispers carried easily. A careless word about good food could draw attention. Travelers kept silent, avoided boasting, and sometimes spread rumors of scarcity instead. To say, "I have nothing left," was often more effective than knots or seals. Words themselves became another layer of protection. Of course, there were failures. Stories told of travelers waking to find their bags cut open, their cheese gone, their grain scattered. Some confronted thieves and caused noisy fights, while others simply accepted the loss, learning sharper tricks the next time. No strategy was perfect, but each one bought time, and time often meant survival. So why call this chapter Guarding Food at Inns? Because inns were both refuge and risk, places where food could vanish as easily as shadows in candlelight. Travelers understood that protection didn't end at the doorway. It followed them inside, demanding cleverness, patience, and quiet endurance. And if you've enjoyed following these quiet strategies of survival, you may gently subscribe so that each new journey into the forgotten details of everyday life arrives like a guarded bundle, carried safely through the night and opened only when the time is right. Have you ever noticed how the world feels different after sunset? Roads grow unfamiliar, sounds echo strangely, and even familiar objects take on new shapes. For travelers in centuries past, the dangers of night extended beyond shadows and silence. Night time was when food became hardest to protect. The quiet hours held special challenges, and it was in the darkness that the cleverest tricks were often tested. The first problem was rest itself. Sleep was necessary, yet it left travelers vulnerable. To close one's eyes meant trusting that bags and bundles would remain untouched. Have you ever tried to sleep while worrying about losing something precious? Rest comes slowly, if at all. Many travelers solved this by using their food as pillows, tying bags under their heads or beneath their cloaks. Some even looped straps around their wrists or ankles so that a tug would wake them. The second challenge was animals. Darkness emboldened them. Rats scurried more freely at night, owls swooped, foxes prowled, and insects crept into every corner. A loaf of bread that seemed safe at dusk could be gnawed by dawn. To fight this, travelers hung food from branches, suspended it between posts, or placed it near their fire. Ashes were sprinkled around, creating barriers that tiny feet hesitated to cross. Yet even so, sleep was never entirely peaceful. The third challenge came from people. Thieves preferred the night. In camps and inns, even on open roads, darkness provided cover. A quick hand could slip into a bag unseen. To guard against this, some travelers placed noisy items atop their bundles, pebbles in bowls, shells strung together, or loose boards that clattered when touched. These simple alarms turned silence into a warning system. Have you ever been startled awake by a small noise and felt your heart race? That was precisely the point. Better to wake too often than not at all. Weather added to the difficulty. Night brought dew, dampening cloth, and softening bread. To protect food, travelers wrapped it in waxed fabric or placed it in leather pouches hung high from the ground. Cold air also stiffened knots, making them harder to undo but also more difficult for the owner to open quickly. Everything slowed in the dark, every task made clumsy by fatigue and shadow. One of the strangest tricks involved deception. Some travelers left false bundles in plain sight, bags filled with stones or scraps, placed where a thief might grab them quickly. Meanwhile, the real food lay hidden in less obvious places, under a sleeping mat, inside a rolled cloak, or buried shallowly under earth. The thief, satisfied with the decoy, vanished into the night, never realizing the true provisions remained safe. But deception was not only for thieves. Companions, too, were watched at night. Hunger made honesty fragile. A friend who had walked beside you by day might be tempted to take from you by night. That was why many travelers staged their sleeping places carefully, lying with their food between themselves and a wall or tree, so no hand could reach without touching them. Night also tested memory. In darkness, bags looked alike. Knots tied tightly at dusk were hard to untie at dawn. More than one traveler misplaced food by confusing their own bundles, leaving something behind in haste. To prevent this, they tied markers to their bags, a strip of cloth, a carved stick, a pebble knotted into rope, small signs that could be felt in the dark, telling them which was which. So why call this chapter Nighttime Challenges? Because the hours of darkness tested every trick, every precaution, and every ounce of patience. By day, food could be watched. By night, it had to be trusted to clever knots, to noisy alarms, to disguises, and to restless sleep. Night reminded travelers that food was not just a burden of weight, but a burden of worry, one carried even in dreams. Have you ever placed something valuable in your pocket and felt safer, knowing it was mixed with the ordinary? Travelers centuries ago understood this instinct. They often hid their food not in special containers or secret compartments, but among their clothing. To the quick glance of a thief or the curious eye of a companion, it seemed no more than folded fabric. Yet within it lay bread, cheese, or dried fruit, small meals disguised by the softness of cloth. Clothing was a natural shield because it traveled everywhere. Every bundle of garments looked the same, shirts folded, trousers rolled, cloaks stacked. To slip food among them was to bury it in plain sight. A thief searching quickly rarely bothered to sift through layers of cloth. They looked for purses, for leather pouches, for jars with weight. A bundle of clothing seemed too dull, too ordinary to matter. The trick was in placement. Bread was wrapped in undershirts, folded so the shape was hidden. Hard cheese was tucked into stockings, the thick fabric masking its outline. Dried beans or nuts were poured into small cloth bags, tied, and then slipped into cloaks, their weight explained away as folds of fabric. Have you ever lifted a bundle of laundry? It always feels heavier than it looks. That was the advantage travelers used. Clothing also provided cushioning. Food hidden within layers was less likely to be crushed or broken. A jar wrapped in a cloak could survive bumps on the road. A loaf wrapped in linen remained intact after miles of jostling. Protection and disguise came together, making garments the safest of hiding places. But the trick went deeper than simply tucking food into bundles. Travelers used clothing to create false impressions. A bag of garments tied tightly, with nothing showing, looked uninteresting. At the same time, food hidden within made it more valuable than any visible pouch. Some even rubbed soot or dust into outer layers, making the clothing appear too dirty to touch. Thieves often ignored what looked unpleasant, and thus the treasure inside remained safe. There were cleverer methods still. Travelers sometimes carried food in worn shoes, cleaned and stuffed with provisions, then tied to the outside of their packs. To the eye, they looked like nothing more than spare footwear. To the owner, they carried precious meals. Others stitched small pockets into linings of cloaks or belts, where dried berries or nuts could be hidden without detection. These secret compartments were rarely noticed, even by those who handled the clothing directly. Yet hiding food with clothing carried risks. Cloth absorbed smell. A piece of cheese, wrapped poorly, might stain fabric and release a scent that betrayed its presence. Bread, left too long, crumbled into crumbs that clung to folds, leaving telltale signs. Travelers learned to double wrap with waxed cloth or to store food that produced little odor. Mistakes could cost both food and clothing, leaving garments ruined by damp or grease. Still, the trick endured because it worked. A thief in haste passed by bundles of clothing. Companions searching discreetly overlooked them. Even innkeepers, suspicious of travelers' packs, often left clothes untouched. What use was a worn cloak compared to a pouch of coins? And so, hidden within garments, food survived journeys that would otherwise have left travelers hungry. So I call this chapter, Food Hidden with Clothing, because garments were more than warmth. They were shields, disguises, and secret containers. Travelers learned that the safest place for food was often not in a jar, not in a bag, not even beneath a pillow, but within the folds of what they wore every day. Have you ever left something behind and worried that, upon returning, it might not be as you left it? Travelers in earlier centuries faced this fear constantly. They carried food not only in danger of being stolen outright, but of being tampered with, opened quietly, a portion taken, and the rest left behind. To prevent this, they developed clever ways of marking and sealing their food so they would know instantly if anyone had touched it. The most common method was the knot. A traveler tied their bag with a distinctive twist, loop, or braid. It was not enough to simply tie it tightly. The knot had to be unique, something the owner recognized by feel. Have you ever made a knot that only you knew how to undo quickly? For travelers, that was the goal. If the knot was different upon waking, or if the rope felt wrong in the dark, the warning was clear. Someone had meddled with their food. Wax was another safeguard. Jars, pouches, or cloth bags were sealed with drips of melted wax pressed firmly into folds or knots. To break the seal was to leave a mark. Wax cracked loudly and visibly. Some travelers pressed personal signs into the wax with a ring or stick, creating impressions that could not easily be copied. If the mark was broken or missing, the owner knew what had happened. For those without wax, soft clay or mud served as a substitute. A small lump pressed over a knot dried into a brittle seal that crumbled if disturbed. It was not elegant, but it was effective. Even simple ash or soot could be sprinkled over the top of a bundle, leaving smudges if fingers touched it. These methods did not prevent tampering, but they exposed it. And exposure was often enough. Marking went beyond seals. Some travelers hid tiny tokens inside their bags, a pebble, a carved stick, a feather. If the food was disturbed, the token was displaced or missing. The trick was simple but powerful. A thief might take food, but not think to replace the marker. To the owner, its absence shouted louder than any broken knot. Others used stitching. They sewed the mouths of bags with thread that was knotted in distinctive ways. To open the bag, one had to cut or unravel the thread, leaving obvious signs. In some cases, different colored threads were woven into seams, making it impossible to repair without notice. A clever thief might untie a knot, but stitching demanded more effort, and most lacked the patience. Even smell and touch were used as markers. A traveler might rub their bags with herbs, so the familiar scent warned them if someone had replaced the cloth. Or they might fold the fabric in a special way, memorized by the hand. When unpacking, if the folds felt strange, the truth was clear. These tricks relied not on strength, but on memory, a personal knowledge of how things should be. Why were these tricks so important? Because sometimes theft was partial. A thief did not always take everything. Sometimes they stole just enough to avoid notice. A handful of grain, a slice of bread, a cut of cheese, small losses that, if undetected, weakened the traveler over time. Marking and sealing forced thieves into a choice: take nothing or take everything, and most feared being caught with the latter. So why call this chapter Marking and Sealing Against Tampering? Because travelers understood that food was too precious to lose even a little. They created ways to make invisible theft visible, to turn silence into alarm, to let every knot and stitch become a guard. These small signs spoke loudly to their owners, ensuring that food remained not only in place but intact, untouched by hands that did not own it. Have you ever carried something heavy for so long that you stopped noticing its weight, yet still felt the ache in your shoulders when you finally set it down? Travelers of earlier centuries lived with that feeling constantly. Food was not only a necessity, it was a burden, one they had to guard, balance, and carry with endless care. And in that burden lay both the danger and the strange tricks of survival. Food was heavy. Grain, the most common provision, grew heavier with each mile. A small sack seemed light at the beginning of a journey, but after hours of walking, it pulled at the back and shoulders, slowing every step. Cheese, dried meat, or bread, though lighter, still added up. Have you ever tried to carry even a simple bag of flour for a distance? Imagine doing so for days, across roads rutted with mud or hills lined with stones. That was the daily challenge of every traveler. The burden of food created new dangers. A weary traveler moved slower, became more vulnerable, and looked like an easy target. Thieves could see the sag of a pack, the bulge of provisions, and guess where the treasure lay. Animals, too, were drawn to the smell carried with each step. The very act of carrying food marked a person as worth following. To manage the burden, travelers developed tricks of balance. They distributed food among multiple bags, shifting weight from shoulder to hip, from back to belt. Some tied smaller pouches around their waists, spreading the load evenly. Others carried staffs with bags slung at either end, like scales across their shoulders, letting the weight swing with their steps. These methods were not comfortable, but they made the burden easier to endure. Food was also shifted according to danger. In safe places, heavier sacks might be carried openly, balanced carefully. In dangerous stretches, food was divided, a portion hidden in clothing, another in baskets, another disguised as tools. If one bag was stolen, the rest remained. In this way, travelers never carried their treasure all in one place. The burden was shared not only by the body, but by strategy. At inns or camps, the weight of food shaped behavior. Travelers often set their packs within reach, leaning them against walls or using them as pillows. To keep food near meant to keep it safe. Yet this closeness meant the burden never left. Even in sleep, food was part of the body, tied to wrists or ankles, so that any tug would wake the traveler. Imagine never laying down a burden fully. That was the price of safety. But there was another layer to this burden. Food grew lighter each day, but as it did, worry often grew heavier. Have you ever eaten the last of something and felt unease about what comes next? Each bite shortened the journey's safety, and each meal forced the question, would the food last until the destination? The weight of food was both physical and mental. Travelers sometimes pretended their food was lighter than it was. They joked, sang, or spoke of it casually, masking the strain. Yet their bodies told the truth. Shoulders rubbed raw by straps, hips bruised by belts, backs bent under weight. Some wore extra padding, cloth folded beneath ropes, or leather sewn into straps to soften the bite. Small tricks, but they meant the difference between endurance and collapse. So why call this chapter The Burden of Carrying Food? Because food was more than something to eat. It was a constant weight, a visible sign of survival, a target for thieves, a magnet for animals. Every step with food was slower, riskier, harder. And yet, every step without it was unthinkable. And if you find meaning in how even the simplest parts of life carried such hidden struggles, you may gently subscribe. Just as travelers bore their burdens to ensure the road ahead, your support carries these stories further, allowing each hidden corner of history to be uncovered and shared. Have you ever tried so hard to protect something, only to watch it slip away despite every effort? For travelers in earlier centuries, no matter how clever their tricks, no matter how careful their hands, there were times when food was lost. And those moments taught lessons more enduring than success. The failure could come suddenly. A bag slipped from a weary shoulder, tumbled down a slope, and split open on stones. Grain scattered, rolling into cracks, impossible to gather. Bread fell into mud, soaking instantly, ruined in seconds. A jar broke, clay shattering, the contents wasted. Have you ever dropped something precious and heard it smash, knowing it could not be repaired? That was the sound travelers dreaded most. Failure also came quietly. A knot thought secure loosened in the dark. By morning, half the provisions had spilled unnoticed along the road. Food, once carefully hidden, betrayed itself with crumbs. Insects crept in through tiny holes, unseen until supplies were opened. Rot spread inside sealed containers, spoiling food from within. The traveler discovered the loss too late, staring at what had once been a treasure and was now only waste. Sometimes the tricks failed against people. Thieves learned faster than expected. A bag disguised as laundry was cut open anyway. A pouch sealed with wax was broken and resealed clumsily, the tampering obvious but the food still gone. Decoy food worked only when robbers were hurried. Those with patience searched longer, uncovering the real supplies. Even companions, once trusted, took advantage. Hunger sharpened suspicion, and clever tricks could not always shield against desperation. Animals proved equally relentless. Rats chewed through leather. Dogs pawed at baskets until they tore. Birds learned to recognize coverings, pecking persistently until they reached the food. Even ashes, herbs, and smoke sometimes failed. Nature's persistence outmatched human ingenuity more often than travelers admitted. And yet, failure was not the end. The road demanded resilience. A traveler who lost food one day had to find another way to continue. They foraged, traded, begged, or endured hunger until help appeared. Some improvised, turning to edible roots or stretching what remained by mixing grain with water into thin gruel. Survival depended less on never failing than on learning how to rise after each failure. Stories told of travelers who laughed at their own mistakes. One recalled dropping an entire loaf into a stream, watching it float away while their companions cursed. They joked later that at least the fish ate well. Another remembered discovering insects in their grain and declaring, with grim humor, that they had gained meat after all. Humor was its own trick, turning disaster into something endurable. But the deeper lesson was humility. Travelers learned that cleverness had limits. No knot was perfect, no disguise foolproof, no seal unbreakable. Food was fragile because life itself was fragile. The road reminded them daily that survival required more than tricks. It required patience, endurance, and acceptance of loss. So why call this chapter When Tricks Failed? Because the history of survival is not only about success. It is also about the moments when bags split, jars cracked, thieves outwitted disguises, and animals triumphed. These failures were as common as victories, and they shaped travelers as much as their clever tricks did. Have you ever finished a journey and found yourself remembering not the destination but the struggles of the road? For travelers in earlier centuries, food was always part of that memory. It was not simply nourishment. It was the quiet weight on their backs, the treasure they guarded, the worry that walked beside them. And when the journey ended, what remained was the memory of how fragile safety had been, and how clever they had needed to be to protect it. Each trick, no matter how simple, told a story. A knot tied in a peculiar way carried the memory of nights when theft was feared. A pouch rubbed with ash reminded its owner of rats scratching at the edges of a camp. A jar sealed with wax bore the faint mark of its owner's hand, pressed deep one restless evening. These objects were not merely containers of food. They were records of human caution, written in rope, cloth, and clay. Travelers remembered the burden of weight, too. Shoulders ached long after they had rested, and scars from straps lingered. The sound of jars clinking, the feel of sacks pressing against their hips, the endless balancing of loads, all became part of their recollection. Food was heavy, yes, but heavier still was the worry of keeping it safe. To carry food was to carry both sustenance and fear. But alongside fear, there was pride. Do you remember the relief of solving a problem, no matter how small, and knowing it saved you from trouble? Travelers felt that pride when their trick succeeded. When a thief walked away fooled by decoy food, when a rat gave up against ashes spread in a circle, when an inn companion turned away from bundles disguised as laundry, in those moments, the traveler felt clever, capable, and just a little safer. Food's fragility also shaped companionship. Groups bonded over shared tricks, teaching one another the best knots, the strongest herbs, the cleverest hiding places. They told stories of what had worked and what had failed, passing knowledge as carefully as bread itself. A road that might have been lonely became a place of shared wisdom, where every traveler's mistake became another's lesson. Yet even with all the tricks, food remained uncertain. A bag could break, an animal could sneak, a thief could outwit. No method promised perfection. That fragility itself became part of memory, a lesson in humility. Travelers learned that survival depended not only on clever tricks, but also on endurance, patience, and resilience. To lose food was to suffer, but to continue walking despite the loss was to triumph. Inns, camps, marketplaces, forests, and lonely roads all carried echoes of food's hidden dangers. Long after the meals were eaten, travelers recalled the fear of waking to rustling paws, the relief of finding a knot still tied, the suspicion of eyes watching too closely. Have you ever tasted a meal and remembered not its flavor, but the effort it took to protect it? That was the experience of countless journeys. So why close with the memory of food's fragile safety? Because in the end, food was never truly safe. It was always at risk, from thieves, from animals, from weather, from simple accidents. The memory of travel was the memory of guarding something that could never be fully secured. And in that fragility lay the deeper story, not just of survival, but of human ingenuity, persistence, and quiet courage. And if you've walked through this history with me, from the fear of losing food, to the disguises and decoys, to the failures and the burdens, I invite you to gently subscribe. Just as travelers carried their provisions carefully along the road, your support carries these stories further, ensuring that the hidden corners of everyday life continue to be uncovered, one quiet detail at a time.